Fanny Alger was
Fanny Alger.
Fanny Alger.
Fanny Alger.
Fanny Alger with
Fanny Alger.
Fanny Alger.
People make a really big deal about the infamous Fanny Alger. What if I told you the whole hired girl incident is actually much ado about a giant nothing burger? I know, I'm crazy, right? Because you might have heard stuff like this.
Emma caught them in the act in their barn.
She went to the barn
She looked through a crack.
and saw the transaction.
Emma Smith saw Joseph and Fanny in the barn, and she saw the transaction.
She looked through a crack
And saw the transaction.
Because of all the people saying stuff like that, it makes good people have serious questions.
I am reading my scriptures. I am going to the temple. I'm not looking at pornography. I genuinely am curious about this Fanny Alger situation.
But when people can't get good, honest answers, they're bound to get terrible answers like,
Emma apparently caught Joseph in the barn having sex with Fanny Alger. Oliver Cowdery found out about it, called Joseph Smith an adulterer, said he was part of a dirty, filthy, nasty affair. That's what Joseph did. He excommunicated Oliver Cowdery. Did you know, were you ever told that the scribe to the Book of Mormon was excommunicated for rightly accusing Joseph Smith of adultery?
No.
and after hearing so-called experts say stuff like that, so many people end up coming to these conclusions.
Was it a secret marriage ceremony, or was he raping her? I think rape is more likely.
The saddest part is these good people all think something happened between Joseph and a girl in a barn because of historians who view Joseph like this.
Welcome to Gospel Tangent. I'm excited to have Dr. Christopher Smith on the show.
Joseph Smith, a prophet of God?
No. I think Joseph Smith had narcissistic personality disorder. I also think he knew that what he was doing was that he was lying, and that he was like deceiving people and cheating on his wife.
It's because of the less than careful work of biased historians that people think that something actually happened between Joseph and the hired girl. Well, today I'm going to put to rest once and for all the idea that Emma caught Joseph in the barn with Fanny, because that is based on a provable lie. On today's episode of Still Mormon. Ready? Let's go. This is Still Mormon, the show dedicated to unsettling Mormon history. Joseph Smith versus the Polygamists, the history the historians never told you, Part 5. Welcome back to Still Mormon. I'm Jeremy, your host. I'm so glad you're back with me. If you haven't already, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel so you can get notified immediately when I post new content. Please hit the like button, leave me a comment. I really appreciate it. Now, let's be honest. The whole reason we talk so much and care so much about this notion of Joseph Smith and polygamy is about one thing, really: sex. The idea that Joseph Smith was having sex with anyone other than Emma, whether the relations are authorized or just illicit affairs, it's a difficult circle to square. If there's no sex in the equation, then really what are we talking about? It is, after all, primarily about that: sex. Well, some years ago, I was sent a recording of a fascinating conversation between two people and a very well-known Mormon historian, the Dean of Mormon history, Richard Bushman. Here's a portion of that conversation.
Do you believe that Joseph Smith had sex with these women?
Right.
Well, but where it goes off the tracks is when you have these younger girls and all of,
but see, you don't want to worry about too much about that.
Wait, what? We don't want to worry too much about Joseph having sex with young girls? Why shouldn't we, Dr. Bushman? Well, at the end of today's episode, I'll play you the rest of what this famous historian has to say on that uncomfortable subject. You are not going to want to miss it, because he would definitely disagree with historians who believe that barn story. And boy, historians like that one. But did you know that the idea of Emma catching Joseph with Fanny in a barn comes from only one person? In 1872 and 1875, 28 and 31 years after the death of Joseph Smith, a source that virtually every historian of Mormon history cites as credible to one degree or another. Well, on today's episode of Still Mormon, I'm going to show you where the whole Fanny saga fits on our timeline, and help you see why the story of Emma catching her husband in a barn having sex with a teenage girl is patently not true. Next, we move to Kirtland, Ohio. In 1835, while working on compiling the new Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph began to teach a few of the saints a new concept, that marriages can persist beyond this life. On the 26th of May, 1835, in Kirtland, Ohio, while serving as Joseph's scribe, William Wines Phelps wrote to his wife Sally, who was at home in Missouri, quote, "A new idea, Sally. If you and I continue faithful to the end, we are certain to be one in the Lord throughout eternity. This is one of the most glorious consolations we can have in the flesh." Apparently, William was so impressed by what he was learning that on July 20th, 1835, he had Joseph write a few words to Sally as well. Joseph wrote, quote, "Sister Phelps, as Brother Phelps has given me an opportunity in his letter, I gladly improve it. How far it may be to your edification, I know not, but trust you will receive it in a manner that shall answer my intention in so doing. For my intention is to give you a word of consolation, to strengthen you in the absence of your most worthy companion, and husband, whose merits and experience and acquirements but few can compete with in this generation. Fewer, I fear, will even appreciate the worth of such men upon whom God in his wisdom hath bestowed gifts that duly qualify them to lead men in the way of life and salvation. I consider in some degree how great a trial you must have had in this separation, but I think I may safely say that you may rest with a firm reliance that God will so order it that you may not be separated, but only for a short season, and then your joy will be full. And if faithful, he will return and teach you things that have been hid from the wise and prudent, hidden things of old times, as Moses said in Deuteronomy 33rd chapter, 19th verse, "For they shall suck of the abundance of the seas and of the treasures hid in the sand." Some of these things have begun to come forth. Therefore, lift up your heart and be glad. Be comforted, be faithful, pray in faith, and in fine, say to all the saints in Zion, "As the Lord God liveth, the redemption of Zion is nigh at hand, and we shall live to see it." J. Smith, Jr. Then, on the 17th of August, 1835, at a special conference to present the new Doctrine and Covenants for acceptance by the Church, Joseph, who was traveling at the time, had Phelps read the entire article on marriage, section 101, which, as we discussed in a previous episode, established monogamy as the law for the Church and specifically proclaimed against polygamy. From the minutes of the conference we read, quote, President W. Phelps then read the following article on marriage, which was accepted and adopted and ordered to be printed in said book by a unanimous vote. The article on marriage declared, quote, "Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached for the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in a case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again." A few weeks later, William wrote again to his wife Sally more about what he'd been learning from Joseph. Phelps explained, quote, "I have it in my heart to give you a little instruction so that you may know your place and stand in it, believed, admired, and rewarded in time and in eternity." Then on the 16th of September, 1835, Phelps again wrote to his wife, quote, "Brother Joseph has preached some of the greatest sermons on the duty of wives to their husbands and the role of all women I ever heard. I would not have you ignorant, Sally, of the mystery of men and women, but I cannot write you all. You must wait till you see me. This much, however, I will say, that you closed your fourth letter to me in a singular manner. Really it was done after the manner of the Gentiles. Says Sally, remain yours till death. But since you have seen my blessing, I think you will conclude, if your life and years are as precious in the sight of God as mine, thus you will be mine in this world and in the world to come. And so long as you can remain on earth as you desire, I think you may as well use the word forever as till death. This is the reason why I called you at the commencement of this letter my only one, because I have no right to any other woman in this world, nor in the world to come, according to the law of the celestial kingdom." think about the implications of this for a moment. Phelps tells us that Joseph preached some of the greatest sermons he'd ever heard. Unfortunately, we don't have the text of those sermons. We only have William's mention of it. However, Phelps tells us that Joseph taught that according to the law of the celestial kingdom, William and Sally could be married for eternity. Joseph gave these sermons in 1835. As far as I'm aware, this is the earliest record we have of this remarkable teaching. But notice what else he taught in conjunction with eternal marriage. William says Joseph expressly taught him and others that they had, quote, no right to any other woman in this world, nor in the world to come, except their one wife. This proves that Joseph's earliest teaching on eternal marriage was that the celestial law expressly excludes polygamy. And we can say with confidence that Joseph's definition of, quote, celestial marriage in 1835 was eternal monogamy. Despite knowing this and writing it to his dear wife, after Joseph's death, Phelps would betray the prophet's instructions to him and take additional wives starting in 1846. Unfortunately, his dear wife Sally, with whom he had 11 children, would not be his only one. Even more strange is a letter Phelps wrote to Brigham Young on August 12, 1861, where Phelps details what he called the, quote, substance of a, quote, revelation he claims was given by Joseph to 7 men on July 17, 1831. The 7 elders he claims received this revelation were Joseph Smith Jr., Oliver Cowdery, W. Phelps, Martin Harris, Joseph Coe, Ziba Peterson, and Joshua Lewis. Phelps proceeds to recount a lengthy revelation supposedly from the Lord 30 years earlier, verbatim, from memory, that claimed to authorize Joseph and those 7 men to take, quote, wives among the Lamanites, to make their, quote, posterity white, delightsome, and just, for even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles. Phelps then states to Brigham, quote, about 3 years after this was given, I asked Brother Joseph privately how we that were mentioned in the revelation could take wives from the natives, as we were all married men. He replied instantly, in the same manner that Abraham took Hagar and Keturah, and Jacob took Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah by revelation. The saints of the Lord are always directed by revelation. Well, it's strange that none of these other men would ever mention this, not Martin Harris, and especially not Oliver Cowdery, who, as we will see, Oliver would have ample reason to reveal it if it were true. Also, we should note that Phelps claimed that he talked with Joseph about 3 years after July of 1831, putting that sometime around mid-1834. This would be merely a year before the instructions we now know Joseph gave Phelps on monogamous eternal marriage in 1835. Many historians and researchers doubt the veracity of Phelps' letter. The apologist organization FAIR notes the following, quote, at present, the only evidence that an 1831 revelation was given is the 1861 document written by Phelps. It's important to note that Phelps wrote his note 30 years after the revelation was said to have been given, after polygamy had been openly practiced for a number of years. Well, the accounts in Phelps' 1861 letter to Brigham and the 1835 letter to his wife Sally, they cannot both be true. Do we believe Phelps' 30-year-old recollection about what would be the very first polygamy revelation that only he knew existed? Or the contemporaneous love letter to his beloved wife very shortly after hearing Joseph's teachings in 1835 about the celestial law of eternal monogamy? We get to decide, and we should decide, which is true. One final note on this point. On the 16th of June, 1844, in what I believe was his last known sermon to the saints prior to his murder, Joseph proclaimed the following, quote, I am bold to declare I have taught all the strong doctrines publicly, and always stronger than what I preach in private. 6 days earlier, on June 10, 1844, in a city council meeting, Joseph responded to allegations that he had been teaching a polygamy revelation secretly. From the Nauvoo City Council minutes of that meeting, we read Joseph's response to those allegations. Quote, He said he had never preached the revelation in private. Let me pause here for a second. The revelation he's referring to is an actual revelation that he had preached on June 16, 1844. This was a revelation about eternal marriage, but it had nothing to do with polygamy, as he will say. Again, quote, he had never preached the revelation in private as he had in public, had not taught it to the highest anointed in the church in private, which many confirmed. On inquiry, the passage in the resurrection, they neither marry and etc., I received for answer, men in this life must be married in view of eternity, was the amount of the revelation. Well, Joseph and his brother Hiram, who also made similar remarks denying there was a revelation on polygamy, had the minutes of the council published in the papers. Well, think about that. Joseph was very clear. He declared openly and emphatically that he never taught polygamy privately to any person, not any of the leaders in the church. He taught all of the strong doctrines like plurality of gods, the fullness of the priesthood, the second comforter, baptism for the dead, and others. He taught those strong doctrines publicly. The contemporaneous record backs up Joseph entirely, and this very important letter from William Phelps to his wife Sally, this letter proves that what Joseph was indeed teaching on marriage from 1835 was that only monogamous marriages could be eternal. Remember what Phelps wrote, quote, this is the reason why I have called you my only one, because I have no right to any other woman in this world, nor in the world to come, according to the law of the celestial kingdom. Let that sink in for a moment. On the 24th of November, 1835, Joseph wrote in his journal, quote, I had an invitation to attend a wedding at Brother Hiram Smith's in the evening, also to solemnize the matrimonial ceremony between Newell Knights and Lydia Goldthwaite. I and my wife went. When we arrived, a considerable company had collected. The bridegroom and bride came in and took their seats, which gave me to understand that they were ready. I requested them to arise and join hands. I then remarked that marriage was an institution of heaven, instituted in the Garden of Eden, that it was necessary that it should be solemnized by the authority of the everlasting priesthood. Before joining hands, however, we attended prayers. I then made the remarks above stated. The ceremony was original with me. It was in substance as follows. You covenant to be each other's companions through life, and discharge the duties of husband and wife. And in every respect to which they assented, I then pronounced them husband and wife in the name of God, and also pronounced the blessings of the Lord conferred upon Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. That is, to multiply and replenish the earth, with the addition of long life and prosperity. Dismissed them and returned home. The weather is freezing cold, some snow on the ground. About this event, the historians from the Joseph Smith papers explain, quote, this marriage, solemnized by Joseph Smith for Newell Knight, a friend of Joseph's from New York years, and Lydia Goldthwaite Bailey, is the first known wedding performed by Joseph Smith. 10 more followed over the next 2 months. Newell Knight recorded, quote, we received much instruction from the prophet concerning matrimony, and what the ancient order of God was, and what it must be again concerning marriage. 2 months later, on the 26th of January, 1836, Joseph again wrote in his journal about another marriage he performed, quote, at evening, I attended at John Johnson's with my family, on a matrimonial occasion having been invited to do so, and to join President John F. Boynton and Miss Susan Lowell in marriage. A large and respectable company assembled. I addressed a throne of grace. I then arose and read aloud a license granting any minister of the gospel the privilege of solemnizing the rites of matrimony, and after calling for objection, if there were any, against the anticipated alliance between Elder Boynton and Miss Lowell, to and waiting sufficient time, I observed that all forever after must hold their peace. I then invited them to join hands. I pronounced the ceremony according to the rules and regulations of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and in the name of God, and in the name of Jesus Christ, I pronounced upon them the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and such other blessings as the Lord put into my heart. Now, as the Joseph Smith Papers historians note, the ceremony Joseph references in his journal that was, quote, according to the rules and regulations of the church, was the ceremony contained in Doctrine and Covenants, section 101 from the article on marriage. As we will see as we continue down the timeline, of the many marriages Joseph performed during his ministry, there is not a single documented plural marriage. In the year 1837, the excommunications for polygamy begin. In May of 1837, Joseph and church authorities felt it necessary to reiterate the church's official position regarding polygamy again. In the church's paper Messenger and Advocate, with Daniel S. Miles serving as editor, we read, quote, "The presidents of the 70s met in council in the house of the Lord on the 29th of April, 1837, and after opening the meeting by prayer, they proceeded to take into consideration some difficulties, either real or imaginary, existing among the 70s, and believing that every elder who is called upon to proclaim the gospel to the nations of the earth should in all things conduct himself like a man of God, adopted among others the following resolutions. First, that we will have no fellowship whatever with any elder belonging to the quorums of the 70s who is guilty of polygamy or any offense of the kind, and who does not in all things conform to the laws of the church contained in the Bible and the Book of Doctrine and Covenants." On November 29, 1837, a man named Solomon Freeman was tried in Kirtland for having 2 wives. From the Kirtland Elder's Record we read, quote, "Fifth, the charge that was preferred before the quorum against Elder Solomon Freeman by William Perry for the crime of polygamy was brought forward. Elder Freeman pled not guilty of the charge. Testimony for the complainant came forward, Dexter Stillman, and stated that Elder Freeman had a wife in Tolland Township, county of Berkshire in Massachusetts, and it was told him there that he, Elder Freeman, came away without his wife. Elder Harlow Redfield stated that when he and Elder Stillman went to see Elder Freeman acknowledged that he had come away and left his wife, as was testified. Elder Freeman acknowledged before the quorum that he had left his first wife, came away with, and soon commenced living with another woman. This was the first of many ecclesiastical actions taken by the church and Joseph Smith against polygamy. The events of the fall of 1837 through the spring of 1838 were devastating to the church, its leaders, and especially Joseph. The failure of the Kirtland Safety Society, a general depression, and financial panic created distress in Kirtland. Tremendous upheavals occurred within church leadership over numerous instances of bad behavior from the likes of Lyman Johnson, David and John Whitmer, W. Phelps, Warren Parrish, and others. In the fall of 1837, Oliver Cowdery, perhaps Joseph's closest associate and friend up to that time, began to criticize Joseph over financial and leadership concerns. Oliver also started to engage in what some considered questionable business practices, and on a number of occasions, some believed he had insinuated that Joseph was guilty of adultery. In late 1837 through April of 1838, councils were held to investigate charges against various church leaders, including Oliver Cowdery. Oliver would be tried on 9 charges and excommunicated on 6 of them. The excommunication of Oliver Cowdery is used to establish the basis of contemporary evidence for Joseph's first alleged plural marriage. But should it be? Remember that for nearly a decade, Joseph and Oliver were extremely close friends and associates. Oliver had served as one of the main scribes of the Book of Mormon, had been ordained to the priesthood under the hand of John the Baptist with Joseph, had been called the second elder of the church, and the two would share many revelatory experiences. How devastating would it have been for Joseph and Oliver to be on opposite sides of a high council trial? Trouble between Joseph and Oliver apparently began to surface in the fall of 1837. On the 4th of September 1837, Joseph wrote a letter to the church that stated in part, quote, "Dear brethren, Oliver Cowdery has been in transgression, but as he is now chosen as one of the presidents or counselors, I trust that he will yet humble himself and magnify his calling. But if he should not, the church will soon be under the necessity of raising their hands against him." On the 6th of November 1837, Joseph and church leaders met in council to resolve many concerns. Oliver was the clerk for the council and recorded, quote, "All difficulties were satisfactorily settled except a matter between Joseph Smith Jr., Oliver Cowdery, and T.B. Marsh, which was referred to themselves with the agreement that their settlement of the affair should be sufficient for the council." The 3 met to discuss the issue later or sometime before Joseph returned to Kirtland. On December 10, 1837, Oliver's brothers, Warren and Lyman, write letters to him. The brothers asked Oliver about a statement Oliver had allegedly made regarding Joseph's relationship with a girl by the name of Fanny Alger. Then, on the 20th of January, 1838, church leaders met with the Zion presidency and Oliver. The chief concern, apparently, was that Phelps, John Whitmer, and Cowdery had recently sold land in Jackson County, which was against the tenets of their faith at the time. Quote, "We took into consideration the proceeding of the presidents in this place," in other words, David Whitmer, W. Phelps, John Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery, "and we, being grieved at their doings after various discussions, appointed a committee to visit them and inquire into their feelings and determinations. After meeting with the church leaders in Far West the next day, January 21st, 1838, Oliver wrote 2 letters, one to Joseph in which he stated, quote, "I learned from Kirtland by these last letters that you have publicly said that when you were here, I confessed to you that I had willfully lied about you. This compels me to ask you to correct that statement and give me an explanation, until which you and myself are 2. On the same day, he also wrote a letter to his brother Warren, quote, "I never confessed, intimated, or admitted that I ever willfully lied about him, Joseph Smith. When he was here, we had some conversation in which, in every instance, I did not fail to affirm that what I had said was strictly true. A dirty, nasty, filthy scrape of his and Fanny Alger's was talked over, in which I strictly declared that I had never deviated from the truth on the matter, and as I supposed, was admitted by himself. From this letter, we learn that Oliver did think some scrape or incident occurred, which he characterized as, quote, dirty, filthy, nasty. We also learn that he merely supposed Joseph had admitted to it, indicating he didn't have direct first-hand knowledge. On the 26th of January, 1838, the High Council questioned Oliver Cowdery, John Whitmer, and W. Phelps. The meeting being organized proceeded to business and heard the report of the committee as follows, in other words, respecting their selling their lands in Jackson County. They, the presidents, declared they had not broken any revelation or law of God in so doing, and further, if they were deprived of that privilege, they would sell their possessions in Far West and move out of the place. And W. Phelps said he would move out of the accursed place, and further, they declared they would not be controlled by any ecclesiastical power or revelation whatever in their temporal concerns. Sometime in early 1838, Apostle Thomas Marsh and High Councilman George Harris and George Hinkle had interviewed Oliver about his accusations against Joseph. Apostle Thomas Marsh and High Councilman George Harris and George Hinkle had interviewed Oliver about accusations they believed he had made against Joseph. On the 15th of February, 1838, Marsh wrote to Joseph to convey information regarding what they had learned from Oliver. Quote, "Agreeable to your request, Brother George W. Harris and myself wrote and sent to you our testimony relative to what Oliver Cowdery said about the girl, and mailed it on the 4th. But lest that letter should not reach you through the inquiry of men, I here send you the same, with the addition of Brother Hinkle's testimony. They may not be the same words as the other, for we have not a copy of the former letter. However, this is the same in substance, with some addition. This may certify that I heard O. Cowdery say to Joseph Smith Jr. while at George W. Harris's house in Far West that he, Joseph, never confessed to him, Oliver, that he was guilty of the crime alleged to him. And O. Cowdery gave me to understand that Joseph Smith Jr. never acknowledged to him that he ever confessed to anyone that he was guilty of the above crime. Thomas B. Marsh." George W. Harris also wrote, "This may certify that I heard Oliver Cowdery say in my house that Joseph Smith Jr. never confessed to him that he was guilty of the crime alleged against him, and Joseph asked if he had ever said to him, Oliver, that he had confessed to anyone that he, Joseph, was guilty of the above crime, and Oliver, after some hesitation, answered no." George M. Hinkle added, "This may certify that having heard the report about the crime above referred to, I asked Oliver Cowdery last fall, when Joseph Smith was in the Far West, if the report was true. For, said I, if it is, as he is to be presented before the church, I wish to know of the truth of this matter beforehand. And he gave me to understand, either in plain words or implications, that it was false. I bear this testimony for the good of the honest-hearted in the East and elsewhere, and for the good of Brother Joseph Smith Jr. Brother Marsh will please copy this in the letter to the East and keep the original here." Thomas Marsh concluded the letter with these words, quote, "Dear brother, We lament that such foul and false reports should be circulated in Kirtland concerning yourself. We are persuaded that none but those who wish your overthrow will believe them, and we presume that the above testimonies will be sufficient to stay the tongue of the slanderer. Yours in the bonds of the new covenant, Thomas B. Marsh. Joseph took a bold step to have this letter published in the Elders' Journal, the church's newspaper, in July of 1838. Then, on the 12th of April 1838, High Priest Seymour Brunson preferred 9 charges against Oliver Cowdery before the High Council. The charges were as follows. First, for stirring up the enemy to persecute the brethren by urging on vexatious lawsuits and thus distressing the innocent. Second, for seeking to destroy the character of President Joseph Smith Jr. by falsely insinuating that he was guilty of adultery and etc. Third, by treating the church with contempt by not attending meeting. Fourth, for virtually denying the faith by declaring that he would not be governed by any ecclesiastical authority nor revelation whatever in his temporal affairs. Fifth, for selling his lands in Jackson County contrary to the revelations. Sixth, for writing and sending an insulting letter to President Thomas B. Marsh while on the High Council, attending to the duties of his office as President of the Council, and insulting the High Council with the contents of said letter. Seventh, for leaving his calling in which God had appointed him by revelation for the sake of filthy lucre and turning to the practice of law. Eighth, for disgracing the church by being connected in the bogus business, or in other words, counterfeiting, as the common report says. Ninth, for dishonestly retaining notes after they had been paid. And finally, for leaving or forsaking the cause of God and returning to the beggarly elements of the world, neglecting his high and holy calling contrary to his profession. From the 12 April 1838 High Council minutes, we find a summary of Oliver's trial. 4 witnesses spoke regarding Oliver's insinuations that Joseph was guilty of adultery. George W. Harris testified, quote, that one evening, last fall, O. Cowdery was at his house together with Joseph Smith Jr. and Thomas B. Marsh when a conversation took place between Joseph Smith Jr. and O. Cowdery when he seemed to insinuate that Joseph Smith Jr. was guilty of adultery. But when the question was put if he, Joseph, had ever acknowledged to him that he was guilty of such a thing, when he answered no. Also, he believes him to be instrumental in causing so many lawsuits as had taken place of late. David W. Patton also testified, quote, that he went to Oliver Cowdery to inquire of him if a certain story was true respecting J. Smith's committing adultery with a certain girl, when he turned on his heel and insinuated as though he was guilty. He then went on and gave a history of some circumstances respecting the adultery scrape, stating that no doubt it was true. Also said that Joseph had told him he had confessed to Emma. Thomas B. Marsh likewise testified, quote, that while in Kirtland last summer, David W. Patton asked Oliver Cowdery if he, Joseph Smith Jr., had confessed to his wife that he was guilty of adultery with a certain girl, when Oliver Cowdery cocked up his eye very knowingly and hesitated to answer the question, saying he did not know as he was bound to answer the question, yet conveyed the idea that it was true. Last fall, after Oliver came to this place, he heard a conversation take place between Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery when J. Smith asked him if he had ever confessed to him that he was guilty of adultery, when after a considerable winking and etc., he said no. Joseph then asked him if he had ever told him that he had confessed to anybody, when he answered no. Finally, Joseph then testified on his own behalf, quote, Joseph Smith Jr. testifies that Oliver Cowdery had been his bosom friend. Therefore, he entrusted him with many things. He then gave a history respecting the girl business. Also, that Oliver Cowdery took him one side and said that he had come to the conclusion to get property, and if he could not get it one way, he would another, God or no God, devil or no devil. Property he must have, and since that, he has dealt dishonest with him, Joseph. That he has taken a printing press and type from Kirtland, for which he was to give up some notes which he had against Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon, which he did not do, nor has to this day. Oliver wrote graciously in defense of himself and addressed only the 4th and 5th charge in detail. With regard to the rest of the charges, he concluded by stating, quote, so far as relates to the other 7 charges, I shall lay them carefully away, and take such a course with regard to them as I may feel bound by my honor to answer to my rising posterity. The council minutes read, the council adjourned 1 hour. The council convened according to adjournment, opened by prayer by Brigham Young. Then, after considering Oliver's defense of himself and hearing all of the testimonies regarding all of the 9 charges, the council concluded and decided that, quote, the 4th and 5th charges were rejected by the court. The 6th charge was withdrawn. After some remarks by the counselors, it was decided by the bishop and his council that the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd charges were sustained. The 7th was sustained. Also, the 8th charge was sustained satisfactorily by circumstantial evidence. The 9th charge was sustained. He was therefore considered no longer a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. After Oliver's excommunication, no one ever charged Joseph with committing adultery or any other offense with Fanny Alger. Now, critics claim that Joseph held kangaroo courts packed by yes-men and that he controlled all church disciplinary proceedings. Well, on the contrary, the actual historical record shows that Joseph was just the opposite. For example, through revelation on November 11, 1831, Joseph had made himself and any president of the church subject to removal, quote, and inasmuch as a president of the high priesthood shall transgress, he shall be had in remembrance before the common council of the church, who shall be assisted by 12 counselors of the high priesthood, and their decision upon his head shall be an end of controversy concerning him. Thus, none shall be exempted from the justice and the laws of God, that all things may be done in order and in solemnity before him, according to truth and righteousness. This law remains in LDS D&C 107, verses 82 through 84. Joseph was anything but a strong man. He could be brought before a court to be tried for his actions. He was charged by fellow leaders of the church on various offenses. On the 29th of May, 1837, apostles Lyman Johnson and Orson Pratt were angry with Joseph and brought formal charges against him. Quote, to the bishop and his council in Kirtland, the stake of Zion, we prefer the following charges against President Joseph Smith Jr., in other words, for lying and misrepresenting, also for extortion, and for speaking disrespectfully against his brethren behind their backs. Lyman E. Johnson, Orson Pratt, May 29, 1837. Joseph put himself up for a vote of the people at least twice. During all of the turmoil of 1837, the saints elected Joseph as president of the church in Zion, despite all of the opposition against him. After all of the trouble in 1842 with John Bennett, who in newspapers throughout the country had very publicly accused Joseph of practicing polygamy, Joseph again subjected himself to a vote of the church and in April of 1843 was unanimously re-elected. Joseph's recommendations to the people were not always accepted and followed. For example, in that same 1843 conference where Joseph was re-elected, he also proposed that Sidney Rigdon be removed as his counselor in the presidency. The church voted against Joseph and to retain Sidney. Instead of acting the part of a dictator, Joseph graciously submitted to the will of the people. Remember, he would say, I teach them correct principles, and they govern themselves. So, when we consider what occurred in Oliver's trial and what Joseph said that was recorded, consider for a moment the following. The following men were present at the trial of Oliver Cowdery: Frederick G. Williams, Thomas B. Marsh, George Hinkle, and John Corrill testified against Oliver. All 4 would be excommunicated months later in 1839. Jared Carter was the council member assigned to represent Oliver. After the martyrdom, he would not follow the saints westward, but instead would affiliate with James Strang until he was excommunicated from that movement in November of 1846. Jared rejoined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints before his death in 1849. According to Benjamin Johnson, who wrote about Jared Carter in 1903, quote, after this, there was some trouble with Jared Carter, and he, through Brother Sherman, I learned that as he had built himself a new house, he now wanted another wife, which Joseph would not permit. And then there was some trouble with Oliver Cowdery, and whisper said it was relating to a girl then living in his family. Sidney Rigdon also testified against Oliver. In 1842, he would have trouble with Joseph over John Bennett's accusations, that Joseph had proposed marriage to his daughter Nancy. After Joseph's death, apparently, Sidney would come to believe Joseph had practiced polygamy. Council member John Murdoch voted against Oliver Cowdery. He would later move to Utah, and only late in life, under ecclesiastical pressure, would take a second wife, but only briefly, though he apparently never consummated the marriage. He was known as a man of great integrity. George W. Harris, a member of the High Council, also testified against Oliver Cowdery. George's wife, Lucinda, is alleged to be a plural wife of Joseph's. Dimmock Huntington testified against Oliver Cowdery. Two of his sisters are alleged to be Joseph Smith's plural wives. 31 years later, in 1869, Dimmock claimed that he married or sealed two of his sisters, Zina and Presendia, to Joseph in 1841. Ebenezer Robinson, the clerk of the council who recorded the entire proceedings, would claim in 1886 that Hiram taught him plural marriage. Thomas Grover, my great-great-great-grandfather, sat on that council that voted against Oliver Cowdery. He would become a prominent Utah polygamist and would later claim that he heard Hiram read the purported polygamy revelation to the Nauvoo High Council in 1843. And lastly, the council minutes state, quote, "The council convened according to adjournment, opened by prayer by Brigham Young." So apparently, Brigham Young also participated in the council. Now, all of these men heard Joseph's explanation of the girl business. If there had been any reason to believe Oliver's insinuations were true, or if Joseph explained plural marriage at all to the council, is it reasonable to believe that all of these men would keep it private and secret? 4 men who would shortly thereafter be excommunicated, including the infamous Thomas Marsh. 3 men who would not follow the migration west, including Sidney Rigdon. 4 men, including Brigham Young, who would be prominent polygamists, and 1 man of great integrity. None of these men ever made direct first-hand statements either accusing Joseph of having an affair or of having been married or sealed to Fanny Alger. Is it reasonable to think that these 12 men would remain silent if there had been anything said or any evidence presented that showed Joseph was guilty? Is it reasonable then when people say the following?
Did you know, were you ever told that the scribe to the Book of Mormon was excommunicated for rightly accusing Joseph Smith of adultery?
No.
Is that reasonable? You decide. In summary, here's what Oliver's trial tells us. Oliver was excommunicated because he had been found guilty of numerous offenses, not merely for his insinuations about Joseph. Those offenses included being connected with counterfeiting and with what was perceived to be immoral business practices. It was not Joseph who excommunicated Oliver, but the council. There is no evidence that Joseph directed or forced the council to excommunicate Oliver, just the opposite. Oliver never explained exactly why he had trouble with Joseph or what he thought happened. We don't know what he had been saying privately or publicly. We only know what he wrote to his brothers. There is no indication that Oliver did actually accuse Joseph of adultery. There is only what some, Thomas Marsh, David Patton, George Harris, and George Hinkle, inferred from Oliver's statements and body language. If Oliver did tell anyone Joseph was guilty of adultery, that record doesn't exist. Oliver admitted to at least 2 people that Joseph had never confessed to being guilty of adultery. After his trial in 1838, there is no record of Oliver mentioning Joseph and Fanny or insinuating Joseph being guilty of adultery ever again. It's clear Oliver doesn't have direct first-hand knowledge. If Oliver knew detailed facts, it seems totally implausible that he wouldn't have used those things to defend himself. All we know is that Joseph entrusted him with many things. We don't know at all what those things were. Were they explicit details about Fanny Alger? We don't know. But it doesn't appear so because Oliver, in his letter to his brother, only characterized something he understood as a, quote, dirty, nasty, filthy scrape. Why wouldn't he be explicit about what he knew if he knew something definitive with his own brothers? We're left to wonder. To draw a certain conclusion is impossible, and we can only wonder what he meant exactly. Oliver never responded to the charge of, quote, destroying the character of Joseph Smith in his own defense letter to the council. We know there was indeed a deep rift between Joseph and Oliver that apparently never healed before Joseph's death. We know that Oliver felt Joseph had accused him of lying, and he denied having lied about Joseph. We know that Joseph felt Oliver was somehow representing him improperly, and Joseph appears to have believed Oliver was lying about him with respect to Fanny. There is no indication from Oliver's insinuations that he believed Joseph was married or sealed to Fanny. Before his death in 1850, Oliver never connected Fanny to Joseph as a plural wife. Joseph explained, quote, the girl business to the satisfaction of the council. That's all we know. The clerk, Ebenezer Robinson, didn't explain what the girl business was. We are left to speculate as to why and what was said. Some have speculated that Joseph was secretly giving orders to the council to keep his affair with Fanny secret. Some historians have suggested that Joseph taught plural marriage or sealing principles secretly to the council. Historian Don Bradley writes, quote, just what Joseph Smith disclosed to the High Council is a mystery. There are several possibilities for how he could have disclosed a confidential relationship and yet have been cleared of adultery. If what he disclosed to the High Council was a physical relationship with Alger, then this could have been regarded as non-adulterous, if for some reason it did not meet the definition of adultery applied. Such a disclosure, if it occurred, could have taken several forms. If Smith reported to the High Council a sexual relationship within a polygamous marriage, this may not have been regarded as meeting the definition of adultery. If non-marital sexual intercourse was disclosed, even this could have been adjudged non-adulterous if adultery was defined per the Hebrew Bible and some early American state laws as sex with another man's wife. Or if Smith reported to the High Council a physical relationship that did not include intercourse in the context of either personal lapse or polygamous courtship, this as well would likely not have been judged adultery. Wow. So this is an example of how some historians try to make sense of this council when they believe something sexual occurred between Joseph and Fanny. But as I've demonstrated, I believe the evidence suggests that it would have been extremely unlikely for something like that to have been kept secret by the 12 men involved. If there had been any substance to Oliver's insinuations or to Joseph having any type of marital or intimate relationship with Fanny, there would have been men on that council who would have exposed Joseph. Remember, 4 of them would be excommunicated within months. The only accurate thing we can say is that evidence shows the High Council believed Joseph and made no connection ever between him and Fanny. Needless to say, people make all kinds of assumptions about the girl business. Those assumptions, as we will see, are based on other sources that come later. It's important and instructive to consider why Oliver thought something had occurred between Joseph and Fanny. All of these facts raise more questions than answers about what happened. What should we ask? Perhaps we should be more circumspect about what we actually know, what we certainly don't know, and what we merely think we know. We also have Oliver's later statements that help us know something else. As we discussed in the last episode, we have Oliver's letter in 1846 to his sister Phoebe, where Oliver reveals his utter shock and dismay learning about polygamy in the church. Remember, he wrote, quote, "Now, Brother Daniel and Sister Phoebe, what will you do? Has Sister Phoebe written us the truth? I can hardly think it possible that you have written us the truth, that though there may be individuals who are guilty of the iniquities spoken of, yet no such practice can be preached or adhered to as public doctrine. Such may do for the followers of Muhammad. It may have done some thousands of years ago, but no people professing to be governed by the pure and holy principles of the Lord Jesus can hold up their heads before the world at this distance of time and be guilty of such folly, such wrong, such abomination." This letter suggests, to almost near certainty, that even after having once believed Joseph of being guilty of some dirty, filthy, nasty scrape, he didn't at all believe Joseph guilty of polygamy. It also suggests Oliver was never in favor of or participated in polygamy, as many historians have asserted. But also, consider the following that we learned from a letter in 1848 from George A. Smith to Orson Pratt. George reports on a conference of the church where Oliver attended and spoke. He writes the following highly instructive report that was printed in the Millennial Star on the 1st of January, 1849. The letter states, quote, October 31st, 1848. We had a meeting on Saturday and Sunday, which we designed as a kind of finish to our conference. Although the weather was very unfavorable, we had nearly 2,000 people on the Sabbath. Oliver Cowdery, who had just arrived from Wisconsin with his family on being invited, addressed the meeting. He bore testimony in the most positive terms of the truth of the Book of Mormon, the restoration of the priesthood to the earth, and the mission of Joseph Smith as the prophet of the last days. For the angel said unto Joseph Smith Jr. in my hearing, that this priesthood shall remain on earth unto the end. End quote. His testimony produced quite a sensation among the gentlemen present, who did not belong to the church, and it was gratefully received by all the saints. Last evening, President Hyde and myself spent the evening with Brother Cowdery. He told us he had come to listen to our counsel and would do as we told him. He had been cut off from the church by a council, had withdrawn himself from it, stayed away 11 years, and now came back, not expecting to be a leader, but wished to be a member and have part among us. He considered that he ought to be baptized and did not expect to return without it. He said that Joseph Smith had fulfilled his mission faithfully before God until death. Oliver would die just 16 months later after he spoke to the church and to George A. Smith and Orson Hyde. Now, does that sound like a man who died believing Joseph Smith had actually been guilty of adultery or polygamy? If he did believe that at one point, is it reasonable to say that he no longer did over time? Finally, the last thing we might take away from the trial of Oliver Cowdery is an understanding that accusations are not proof. Insinuations certainly are not. So let me repeat, accusations are not proof. Let's remember that as we go up through the timeline and discover other accusations that will be leveled against Joseph. As with all of the accusations against Joseph, you must choose whether you believe Oliver's never explained insinuations and what people interpret from those about Joseph having committed adultery, or whether you will believe Joseph himself. Consider Joseph's declaration in his telling of his own history in 1838. After John Whitmer apostatized and took the history that he had kept, Joseph worked to compose a new one. In the new history he would compose, Joseph explained he was a flawed person like us. He wrote, quote, I was left to all kinds of temptations and mingling with all kinds of society. I frequently fell into many foolish errors and displayed the weaknesses of youth and the foibles of human nature, which I am sorry to say led me into diverse temptations offensive in the sight of God. Almost 5 years later, after the relentless accusations of adultery, spiritual wifery, and polygamy that John C. Bennett had leveled publicly against him, Joseph felt it necessary to clarify that portion of his history. On December 2nd, 1842, with Willard Richards acting as scribe, Joseph added the following clarification to his history that, quote, I was left to all kinds of temptations and mingling with society. I frequently fell into many foolish errors and displayed the weaknesses of youth and the foibles of human nature, which I am sorry to say led me into diverse temptations offensive in the sight of God. In making this confession, no one need suppose me guilty of any great or malignant sins. A disposition to commit such was never in my nature, but I was guilty of levity, and sometimes associated with jovial company, etc., not consistent with that character which ought to be maintained by one who was called of God as I had been. But this will not seem very strange to anyone who recollects my youth and is acquainted with my native cheery temperament. Here, Joseph is declaring that the insinuations and accusations made against him by Oliver, John Bennett, and others, that he was guilty of adultery, polygamy, spiritual wifery, or any other malignant sins, were categorically not true. We are left to ask if Joseph is being truthful or not. Now, what I have shared is the full body of contemporary evidence of any relationship between Joseph and Fanny, i.e., there was no adulterous relationship ever established, no inappropriate relationship ever proved. There were only Oliver's insinuations and what others inferred from them. There was never any insinuation or allegation of a marriage. All of it comes from what Oliver assumed and others inferred from Oliver, not from anything else. We simply cannot establish any verifiable relationship or sexual act between Joseph and Fanny based on the contemporaneous data. Now, despite this, because of later stories, which in time I'll address, antagonists, they believe that Joseph was either lying in his explanation of the girl business or that he somehow strong-armed the dozen men to keep his affair secret. Now, this requires us to ask, is it possible to show that Joseph was having an intimate or sexual connection with Fanny based on post-martyrdom claims? Apologists argue that Joseph wasn't lying about greater malignant sins because they say he was married to Fanny and his polygamy was authorized, and he may even have taught the High Council the principles of sealing in order to mollify them. This begs the question, was Fanny Alger Joseph's wife? Was this the earliest authorized celestial plural marriage, as the apologist historians claim? And can the decades later stories provide proof? Now, before we discuss this, let's remember, we have no evidence from Joseph or anyone from 1827 to 1844 that there was anything called celestial plural marriage. Though, as we've shown, Joseph began teaching about the eternal nature of marriage starting in 1835, not even the term, quote, celestial marriage or the euphemism eternal marriage existed during his life that we have any record of. The only references to any form of polygamy thus far, as we have seen and will see throughout the rest of Joseph's life, were unequivocally negative and condemning of it. Polygamy was equated by Joseph Smith with plurality of wives and having many wives and concubines, all terms the Utah Mormons would use interchangeably with what they called celestial plural marriage, but only decades after Joseph was no longer here. But to Joseph, those terms were the same as community of wives, dispensing with the marriage covenant, and spiritual wifery. Joseph condemned all of those terms and equated all of them with adultery during his life. The historians cannot produce a single instance from Joseph's own lips or pen to the contrary. To claim that Joseph taught authorized celestial plural marriage is purely anachronistic and has no contemporaneous anchor to ground that assertion. With that preface, let's begin the discussion of the allegation that Fanny was Joseph's first plural wife. About this alleged marriage, author Brian Hales writes, quote, "Not much is known about this union, as none of the participants elaborated on the topic. What we do have is a collection of late and second-hand reminiscences that may or may not give us clues as to what transpired. No contemporaneous documentation of the association has been found. The evidence is inconclusive regarding the question of whether the Joseph Smith-Fanny Alger plural union included conjugal relations." Okay, so Hales says the body of, quote, evidence related to Fanny being Joseph's wife is a, quote, collection of late and second-hand reminiscences. Now, for the purposes of this episode, since we are dealing with the idea that Joseph may have been guilty of adultery, and since we've introduced the subject of sex and the importance of trying to determine if there's any evidence that Joseph had any sexual relations with any woman other than Emma, remember something that Richard Bushman said we shouldn't worry about.
But where it goes off the tracks is when you have these younger girls and all of, you know, and it...
Yeah, but see, you don't want to worry about too much about that.
Now, I'm going to address just one of the sources, though arguably the most important of them related to Fanny Alger. I want to show how, by this example, oftentimes the sources used to form the narrative about Joseph and polygamy are actually, well, they're just like an elaborate formation of dominoes, which when one of those sources under careful examination begins to tip over, the other sources holding up the narrative too, like dominoes, fall one by one. I will cover extensively every source from that, quote, collection of late and second-hand reminiscences, as Hales calls them, in a later episode, so you can see the many inconsistencies between them and can judge for yourself what they mean, if they're credible, and if they prove at all that Fanny was actually Joseph's wife. But for now, I want to take you through an exercise with just one of those reminiscences from a man named William McLellin in the year 1872, 28 years after Joseph's murder. McLellin, a former apostle turned bitter enemy of Joseph and the church, was excommunicated in 1832, then reinstated, disfellowshipped in 1835, then reinstated, wrote a letter of withdrawal from the church in 1836, then reinstated, finally excommunicated again in 1838. He would unite with David Whitmer after Joseph's death to form the renewed Church of Christ under Whitmer's leadership. In 1861, McLellin had heard a sermon delivered by the deceased prophet's son, Joseph Smith III. So strong was McLellin's reaction to the talk that he felt compelled to write Joseph III the following, quote, "In your speech at Amboy, you said, 'I believe my father was a good man,' and in the same speech you go strongly to condemn the principle and practice of polygamy. I do not wish to say hard things to you of your father, but Joseph, if you will only go to your own dear mother, she can tell you that he believed in polygamy and practiced it long before his violent death, that he delivered a revelation sanctioning, regulating, and establishing it, and that he finally burned the awful document before her eyes. Elder Marks can tell you that before its conflagration, it was read to the High Council of Nauvoo, over which he presided. Your mother told me these items when I was in Nauvoo. I am not dealing in fictions nor in ill-founded slanders, and would now feel glad if these things had never been enacted. But, sir, I have felt it a solemn duty to lay these items before you. And, sir, your mother, if she feels disposed, can give you a rather black catalogue reaching far back as far as the date of your birth. Then, sir, if you are honest before the heavens yourself, never proclaim again publicly or privately that I believe my father was a good man, whilst the means to know his real character lies so near you, even in the bosom and memory of your mother. Now, sir, if your father was a good man and you are his legal successor, then you are legally and morally bound to carry out his measures. Hence I saw in the phrase good man a great deal of meaning. And when I read your speech, taking you to be honest, I felt a pang wring my old aching heart. Joseph, you are but a youth. Do be admonished by one who has grown old. Take not your own dear father for a pattern in your religious career. Although he might have had some good traits, yet in all that constitutes pure godlike goodness, he was woefully lacking. If you have determined to be great in the eyes of God, then do carve out your own course, but not pattern after his." Well, it's abundantly clear that McLellin has no love for Joseph Smith III's father. Then, in July of 1872, McLellin, unable to leave the matter alone, again wrote to Joseph III the following, quote, "Now, Joseph, I will relate to you some history and refer you to your own dear mother for the truth. You will probably remember that I visited your mother and family in 1847 and held a lengthy conversation with her, retired in the mansion house in Nauvoo. I did not ask her to tell, but I told her some stories I had heard, and she told me whether I was properly informed. Dr. F.G. Williams practiced with me in Clay County, Missouri during the latter part of 1838. And he told me that at your birth, your father committed an act with a Miss Hill, a hired girl. Emma saw him and spoke to him. He desisted, but Mrs. Smith refused to be satisfied. He called in Dr. Williams, O. Cowdery, and S. Rigdon to reconcile Emma, but she told them just as the circumstances took place. He found he was caught. He confessed humbly and begged forgiveness. Emma and all forgave him. She told me this story was true. Again, I told her I heard that one night she missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction. She told me this story, too, was verily true. Now, I would not have told you this had it not been for one thing. You said in your speech at Amboy, April 6, 1860, quote, I believe my father was a good man, and a good man never could have promulgated such doctrines. You referred to polygamy. Now, let me tell you, my dear sir, I asked your mother particularly on this point. She said one night, after she and Joseph had retired for the night, he told her that the doctrine and practice of polygamy was going to ruin the church. He wished her to get up and burn the revelation. She refused to touch it, even with tongs. He rose from his bed and pulled open the fire with his fingers and put the revealment in and burned it up. But copies of it were extant, so it was preserved. You say, quote, I have never believed it and never can believe it. Can you dispute your dear mother? She related this to me, and will you ask her to tell you the same thing? It made a powerful impression on my mind at the time, and I've often reflected on it since. Now, sir, suppose you could be convinced that your father not only believed polygamy, but actually practiced it, his individual self. Then what would you say and then do about it? Was he an adulterer so long ago and still a good man? Now, it's important to analyze a few points about this letter. McLellin accuses Joseph of an act with a Miss Hill. Some people conflate this with Fanny Alger, but the truth is, we don't know who the Miss Hill is. No one else mentions Miss Hill. If true, this act would have happened sometime in 1832, the year of Joseph Smith III's birth. Neither Frederick Williams, who was later excommunicated, Oliver Cowdery, who, as we've seen, was at tremendous odds with Joseph and was also excommunicated, nor Sidney Rigdon, who would become deeply hurt over later allegations from John Bennett regarding his daughter Nancy, none of these men ever mentioned anything of the sort when they would have had ample reason to do so. McLellin mentions Fanny Alger by name, and so it's likely he's bringing up two alleged incidents in the letter, although some historians conflate the two into one. He claims Emma, quote, looked through a crack in the barn door and saw the whole transaction. He added 3 exclamation points at the end of the word transaction to drive home the point. Now, it's interesting to note that the story that he claims Emma told him about the revelation differs greatly from the Utah stories that had been and would later be told. So in this account, Emma said Joseph told her polygamy would ruin the church. This statement is much more in line with what former Nauvoo stake president William Marks had written and published in 1853, that Joseph told him personally that, quote, this doctrine of polygamy or spiritual wife system that has been taught and practiced among us will prove our destruction and overthrow, end quote. Marks also wrote in 1859 that Joseph told him that polygamy, quote, eventually would prove the overthrow of the church, end quote. The Utah stories paint Joseph as never having opposed polygamy. McLellin's story alleges Joseph asked Emma to burn the revelation, who then refused, and so Joseph himself burned it. The Utah stories, starting with Brigham Young in 1852, claimed that Emma was the one who burned it. Now, we also should address another source claiming to quote McLellin that may add more context. In an interview with the Salt Lake Tribune just 3 years later, J.H. Beadle, fervent anti-Mormon, reported that, quote, he, McLellin, also informed me of the spot where the first well-authenticated case of polygamy took place, in which Joseph Smith was, quote, sealed to the hired girl. The, quote, sealing took place in a barn on the haymow and was witnessed by Mrs. Smith through a crack in the door. The doctor was so distressed about this case, it created some scandal at the time among the saints, that long afterwards, when he visited Mrs. Emma Smith at Nauvoo, he charged her, as she hoped for salvation, to tell him the truth about it. And she then and there declared on her honor that it was a fact, saw it with her own eyes. The long disputed question then as to whether the prophet did practice polygamy is now effectually set at rest, and Brigham is a little ahead of young Joe on that point. About the time she told the doctor this, Mrs. Smith also published a card in the Quincy Whig in which she stated that she had no faith in the prophetic mission of her, quote, late husband and considered his revelations as the result of a diseased mind. Despite all these experiences, Dr. McLellin is still a firm believer in the Book of Mormon. He thinks it was truly, quote, given by divine inspiration, but that the man to whom the trust was committed proved unfaithful and have gone from bad to worse ever since. So, in this report by Beadle in 1875, if he has accurately conveyed McLellin's words, we have a confirmation and expansion of McLellin's words in his letter to Joseph Smith III. However, Beadle also here reports that Emma publicly stated she had, quote, no faith in the prophetic mission of her late husband and considered his revelations the result of a diseased mind. Of course, there is no record of Emma ever saying anything of the sort. Hence, this, I believe, false attribution to Emma casts some doubt on the accuracy of the rest of Beadle's report. Yet it does clarify McLellin's words that the, quote, transaction Emma allegedly saw was a, quote, sealing ceremony on a haymow. Now, the mention and idea of Joseph being on a stack of hay with Fanny has led many historians and authors to interpret this in a sexual context, especially given that McLellin's letter points up the word transaction with triple exclamation points. They assume McLellin is, of course, speaking of something salacious and scandalous, and perhaps that was indeed McLellin's intent. So, these are all of the sources from William McLellin that deal with Fanny Alger. All of them, the most important being the 1872 letter. Now, if you believe these are credible sources and that McLellin is telling the truth, at least in some degree, it dramatically affects the way that you interpret the contemporaneous data that we've gone through related to Joseph and Fanny, as well as the non-contemporary, decades-old, and often contradictory and inconsistent recollections about the, quote, hired girl and the prophet. Historians and authors wrestle mightily with both groups of data to try to prove their conclusions about Fanny Alger. Moreover, McLellin and his remarks are nearly always at the heart of those conclusions. So to illustrate this point, I'll use what historians Don Bradley and Christopher C. Smith have written in their essay of Generations and Genders, Fanny Alger and the Adoptive Origins of Ritual Sealing. That essay is in the book Secret Covenants by Cheryl Bruno. Bradley and Smith have, in my opinion, they've done the best work of any historians thus far in examining all the sources related to Joseph and Fanny. And I think their essay is really well worth reading. Well, their views are nuanced on what was possibly occurring between Joseph and Fanny Alger, and that it may not have been, at least initially, a marriage. Let's hear from Dr. Chris Smith.
Don was interpreting to mean that there had been a marriage, a sealing ceremony between Fanny and Joseph, and that they had been married. And I proposed, just sort of like off the cuff, reading the sources, it looked to me like they might be saying that it was an adoption sealing and not a marriage sealing.
So I find this fascinating and really intriguing because I've been making a somewhat similar argument for years. In 2019, I gave a talk and I published an essay entitled Of Demigods and Dark Nights, an opening statement in defense of Joseph Smith, in which I stated, quote, because neither Joseph nor Emma said or recorded anything about what he and likely they were doing, it is impossible without divine revelation to know exactly what went on. There are, however, indications that Joseph was practicing something involving sealing and adoption into his and Emma's family. Joseph left only a small hint of what he was endeavoring to do, and he indicated in many of his revelations and public statements that he had received far more from heaven than he ever revealed to the saints. On January 20th, 1844, he said, I have tried for a number of years to get the minds of the saints prepared to receive the things of God, but we frequently see some of them, after suffering all they have for the work of God, will fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions. Well, that's what I wrote in 2019. Let me expand on that today by saying, I think it is really important to consider that Joseph may have been doing something entirely different than what most have conceived, which I believe can be encapsulated in what apparently his own son believed was possible. Joseph Smith III had interviewed one of the women who claimed to be a plural wife of Joseph in 1885 and wrote the following about that interview, quote, "The interview had convinced me that the statement made in an affidavit of this Melissa Lott Willis, published by Joseph F. Smith, along with others of similar import, to the effect that she had been married to Joseph Smith was not true, provided the word married be construed as conveying the right of living together as man and wife, a relation she had unequivocally denied in my presence. I was convinced that wherever the word married or sealed, I'll insert that's in the affidavit, wherever the word married or sealed occurred in such testimonials regarding my father, it meant nothing more than that possibly those women had gone through some ceremony or covenant which they intended as an arrangement for association in the world to come, and could by no means have any reference whatever to marital rights in the flesh." He then later wrote a letter in 1904 to E.C. Brand about Melissa. Quote, "I knew Melissa well, a bright, good girl. Am glad that she was only for eternity or adopted into the family." Now, it has been my belief that it is possible that in some cases, something like what Joseph Smith III posited may have happened with some of the women who claimed later to be wives of his father, was perhaps in some way an adoption into Joseph's family. The concept of people being adopted into Joseph's family actually existed in Utah and persisted long after Joseph's death. For example, consider the words of Eliza R. Snow. Quote, "When persons are adopted to Joseph Smith, they are initiated into his family and become his heirs. A wife or someone to represent wife as proxy must be present, but who is to be the mother is not designated." Anne Eliza Webb, former wife of Brigham Young, believed an adoption of some kind had occurred with Fanny Alger and other girls. She wrote, quote, "Although Fanny's parents were living, they considered it the highest honor to have their daughter adopted into the prophet's family, and her mother has always claimed that she was sealed to Joseph at that time. She also wrote, at one time he had 11 young ladies living in his family as adopted daughters to whom he had been sealed without the knowledge of his wife." Now, Anne Eliza Webb was not alive at the time, and so she gets this through things she's heard, but that is what she believed. Lucy Walker, who was alleged to be Joseph's plural wife, wrote that Joseph had said to her father, quote, "My house shall be their home," referring to his children. "I shall adopt them as my own. The 4 eldest shall come to my house and be treated as my own children." Maria and Sarah Lawrence were in reality adopted as daughters by Joseph and Emma and lived with them for a time. There's much more to say on this, and I will treat this in depth down the road. Suffice it to say for now, there did exist the idea that certain people, especially certain women who were later claimed as Joseph's wives, some of these women had also been thought to be adopted daughters of Joseph and Emma. Now back to historians Bradley and Smith. In their essay, they also assert that the situation with Fanny Alger is not as straightforward as some have made it out to be. They argue that initially, Joseph adopted Fanny by sealing into his family as a daughter. They write, "Smith's relationship with Alger supplies the missing chronological and conceptual link between the Elijah restoration of sealing keys in Kirtland and the performance of marriage sealing rites at Nauvoo. The primary sources on the relationship make 4 salient claims about it. First, Alger was, quote, sealed to Smith, supposedly with her parents' permission. Second, Smith, quote, adopted Alger as his daughter, and her parents, quote, considered it the highest honor. Third, Cowdery is reported to have performed the sealing ceremony, although he later condemned the relationship as, quote, dirty, nasty, filthy, and declined to quell rumors that it was adulterous. And fourth, at the same time as Smith was sealed to Alger, Cowdery is supposed to have been sealed to a girl who lived with Cowdery's family. Other evidence indicates that in Kirtland, Cowdery adopted a daughter named Adeline Fuller. Taken together, these details suggest a novel interpretation. Alger and Fuller were, at least initially, sealed to Smith and Cowdery, respectively, as their ritually adopted daughters rather than as their wives. They also conclude that though they believe Joseph had initially adopted Fanny as a daughter, that the relationship appears to have become intimate. They write, quote, "However it was that the pair's relationship transformed, Emma's fury upon discovering them together on a July night in 1836 verifies that the transformation occurred. Bradley and Smith then reveal the sources they rely on to believe the, quote, transition in Joseph and Fanny's relationship was one of physical intimacy. William McLellin's ambiguous accounts of the, quote, transaction between the two that night, which he also termed a, quote, sealing, suggest that Emma might have observed all or part of a ritual sealing. However, McLellin's statement that the observed sealing occurred on a haymow, i.e. heap of hay, suggests sexual euphemism, and Cowdery's reference to a dirty, nasty, filthy scrape, and Eliza Webb's statement that Emma evicted Alger because of, quote, Joseph's intimacy with her, imply that Emma discovered a close physical or sexual relationship. These options, while distinct, are not mutually exclusive. The unfortunate Emma might have observed all or part of both a marriage ritual and its attempted consummation. Many, if not most readers will, like the authors themselves, be discomfited by the idea of Joseph Smith adopting a daughter and then having an erotic relationship with her. While it is clear that the adult Fanny Alger should not be thought of as a civilly adopted child of Smith's, but as a ritually adopted symbolic daughter, as Brigham Young later regarded himself as a ritually adopted son to Smith, the notion that Smith's initial spiritual adoption of Alger would authorize later romantic and sexual relations is troubling. Smith may have followed his initial ritual spiritual adoptive sealing of Alger with a second overtly marital sealing, or it may be that Smith understood the one sealing ritual between himself and Alger as creating a more abstract bond that would validate any potential sacred relationship between the two. There is, in fact, considerable Nauvoo evidence that esoteric sealings for adoption and marriage had a quality of interchangeability. In the absence of a completed temple in which to perform adoption rituals, sealings of plural marriage were used to bind individuals and families into kinship networks that were broadly adoptive. So, as we can see in Bradley and Smith's detailed analysis, William McLellin's 1872 and 1875 assertions lie at the very heart of the interpretation of all of the source material and provide the primary weight for concluding that Joseph was intimate with Fanny. As I've demonstrated previously, Oliver's belief about Joseph is not based on first-hand knowledge. Eliza Webb likewise provided no first-hand information regarding what she calls Joseph's intimacy with Fanny. Oliver and Eliza cannot in themselves provide us with proof. It's only when you triangulate those sources with what McLellin says that the three together seem to substantiate Joseph's having an erotic relationship with Fanny. Well, if we're going to take that source material seriously, we need to ask some serious questions about William McLellin. Number one is his credibility. Number two, we need to examine carefully the above sources themselves. Number three, we need to see if he, McLellin, is consistent in the telling of his story. Finally, we need to ask ourselves if we should give credence to his testimony about his conversation with Emma. Remember, his words about what he supposedly learned from Emma are the keystone of the whole idea around Joseph and Fanny both being married and being sexually intimate. Without these sources, no other sources provide any substantial proof of an actual marriage or sexual relationship. But first, we must even question the veracity of the whole statement. First, he's recalling an alleged conversation he had 25 years earlier. Did the conversation actually occur? If it did, is his recollection accurate? Remember, McLellin was a bitter enemy of the church and Smith's family. Should we question his motives when assessing the veracity of the letter? Let's consider a few things that were reported about McLellin. In 1859, John Butler recorded in his autobiography, quote, "A man by the name of McLellin, one who had been high in the church and kingdom of God, and had held the office of one of the 12, and another man went into Brother Joseph's house and commenced searching over his things, and Sister Emma asked him why he had done so, and his answer was, because he could. He took all the jewelry out of Joseph's box and took a lot of bedclothes, and in fact plundered the house and took the things off. And while Brother Joseph was in prison, he suffered with the cold. And he sent home to his wife Emma to send him some quilts or bedclothes, for they had no fire there, and he had to have something to keep him from the cold. It was the dead of winter. My wife was up there when the word came, and she said that Sister Emma cried and said that they had taken all of her bedclothes, except one quilt and blanket, and what could she do? So my wife with some of the other sisters said, quote, 'Send him them, and we will see that you shall have something to cover you and your children.' My wife then went home and got some bedclothes and took them over to her." In 1864, the Millennial Star reported the following about McLellin, quote, "He took an active part with the mob in Missouri in robbing and driving the saints. At the time Joseph was in prison, he and others robbed Joseph's house and stable of the following property: 1 roll of linen cloth, a quantity of valuable buttons, 1 piece of cashmere, a quantity of valuable books, a horse and gig, harness, saddle, bridle, etc. While Joseph was in prison at Richmond, McLellin, who was a large and active man, went to the sheriff and asked for the privilege of flogging the prophet. Permission was granted on the condition that Joseph would fight. The sheriff made known to Joseph McLellin's earnest request, to which Joseph consented, if his irons were taken off. McLellin then refused to fight unless he could have a club, to which Joseph was perfectly willing, but the sheriff would not allow them to fight on such unequal terms. Okay, so having been excommunicated around the same time as Oliver Cowdery, McLellin would most likely have known of Oliver's accusations. By his own admission, he didn't have first-hand knowledge. He says he heard stories and that Emma told him they were true. And indeed, he encourages Joseph III to ask her for verification. Well, 2 months before Emma's death in April 1879, her son Joseph III did indeed ask her about the accusations made by men like McLellin. Joseph asked, "What about the revelation on polygamy? Did Joseph Smith have anything like it? What of spiritual wifery?" She replied, "There was no revelation on either polygamy or spiritual wives. It was contrary to the will of heaven. No such thing as polygamy or spiritual wifery was taught publicly or privately by him before my husband's death that I have now or ever had any knowledge of." He then asked, "Did he not have other wives than yourself?" She said, "He had no other wife but me, nor did he, to my knowledge, ever have." Joseph asked, "Did he not hold marital relation with women other than yourself?" She replied, "He did not have improper relations with any woman that ever came to my knowledge." He then asked, "Was there nothing about spiritual wives that you recollect?" She said, "At one time my husband came to me and asked me if I had heard certain rumors about spiritual marriages or anything of the kind, and assured me that if I had, that they were without foundation, that there was no such doctrine, and never should be with his knowledge or consent. I know that he had no other wife or wives than myself, in any sense, either spiritual or otherwise." Between 1852 and 1877, Emma would give numerous interviews to Jason Briggs, Edmund Briggs, Hepworth Dixon, J.C. Christensen, and Mark Forscott. In all of these interviews, she flatly denied the substance of all of McLellin's claims and any other accusation that Joseph had ever received a revelation on plural marriage, that he or she ever burned such a revelation, and that Joseph was ever guilty of practicing polygamy or committing adultery or any other sexual impropriety. In truth, the only person to claim Emma told a different story is McLellin himself. Now, some have assumed there is simply no way to corroborate the alleged conversation with Emma. Many have believed we are left to decide who we're going to trust, McLellin or Emma. Many, if not most, historians choose to believe McLellin.
I know some people are going to call into question McLellin's credibility because he did leave the church. He did kind of become an anti-Mormon, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what do you think? Is that good enough to throw out his testimony there?
No, I mean, like, on just about everything that we can verify, like, he was a solid witness, you know? I mean, he seems to have been, like so many of the dissenters in the Kirtland period, like an upstanding person who, yes, he ends up with an axe to grind, but he grinds it in a fairly responsible way, you know? So,
okay.
Yeah, I think he's a reliable witness.
We can trust McLellin's account there.
However, McLellin gave himself away by something he himself wrote in 1847, at the very time he claims to have learned these things from Emma. In 1847 and 1848, McLellin served as editor of the paper, The Ensign of Liberty, in which he endeavored to promote the newly formed Church of Christ with David Whitmer as its leader. In this paper, McLellin argues that Joseph Smith, though once called of God, was by his death a fallen, even wicked prophet. In December of 1847, McLellin wrote, quote, "And we are bold to affirm that while the prophet Joseph and those connected with him, all as a church wore the name of Christ and endeavored to assimilate themselves into his likeness and were made partakers of the divine nature, no society on earth were prospered and blessed more than they. But when they imbibed the spirit of war, gave to the church a false name, and ran greedily into speculation, pride followed, then oppression and persecution, and hence division and destruction soon came in their train, until now schisms, animosities, and all manner of evil within their reach has marked the course of Latter-day Saintism. And we again say that ruin, inevitable ruin, is their doom. They trust have fallen from a highly favored position. They are apostates from the true order of the house of God. But thank God, the wickedness of the wicked, nor the malice or rage of the vile can change the great and glorious principles of the Church of Christ." We have taken pains to gain intelligence upon this important subject because since the transgressions and death of Joseph Smith, the subject of the leader in his stead has broken the Church of the Latter-day Saints into factions and parties. Now, in January of 1848, he wrote this about Joseph, quote, "But hark, who is yon in the distance, issuing from the mansion house? Who is that so splendidly attired and uniformed with his plume of finest tints waving in the breeze? He moves in the midst of his staff officers, his admirers and flatterers. Who would believe it when told that the moving spirit of that vast conclave, this highest general of all those 1,000 of the Nauvoo Legion, is the head spiritual, temporal, and military of that boastful church of the Latter-day Saints? 'Tis their prophet and leader. 'Tis he who was once so highly favored, who once held that unerring instrument of truth and of power with God, the Urim and Thummim, but alas, who is now in full stretch after the glory of the world. He is determined on distinction, is decreed on the breath of mortals in his own adulation. But again, I must be mayor of the famed city of Nauvoo. I must be head of all her councils, and thus gain distinction as a great civilian. But let us look back and hear that restless, ambitious spirit muse a little. I am head spiritual and temporal of the whole church. I am head military of the Nauvoo Legion, and I am as mayor, civil head of this great city. But here steps up the old whisperer again and says, your friends, since you have sought the glory of this world, have increased to thousands in these United States, and you are so great a man and can do such great things. Why, you can now send out hundreds, yea, thousands of priests to set forth your claims to distinction. You, sir, must now become the head of this great nation in which you live. Now set yourself forward as a candidate for the presidency, the head of this union of states, and then your glory will be complete complete. You can then truly rule and govern spiritually and temporally, and join in your own person the powers of heaven by your priesthood and the powers of earth by your civil authority. But that restless spirit of Antichrist was unwilling to await the decision of an election to the presidency by men. A great council of the heads of the church is called, and the whisperer once more speaks, saying, the offices you now hold, together with one you have in prospect, are not all commensurate with your dignity, with your prowess. You, sir, are so great a man that by your powers and abilities you can govern the world, the whole world. Ah, says the council, that is just the mind of the Spirit which is in us. And accordingly he was crowned King of the world, the universal world, by a conclave of his sages, who then surrounded him. Ah, said Satan to the Savior, as he showed him by visions from the top of an exceeding high mountain, all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, all these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. But Joseph had not the integrity to say as Jesus did, Get thee hence, Satan, for I will worship the Lord my God, and him only will I serve. But the height of power, so far as his friends can give it, is now placed on Joseph's head. He has the ideal pleasure of it, but his race is run. His cup is full. Soon he falls into the hands of his enemies and is unlawfully and meanly murdered. Yet his friends are left to fill up the measure of Antichrist, to put on the capstone, to develop the man of sin in full blaze. The reason why I have written and published the above may be found in the following saying of the Lord revealed to me last September through his seer, David Whitmer, quote, Thou shalt write concerning the downfall of those who once composed my church, and set forth to the world by the light and power of my Spirit, why I, the Lord, did not prosper them. For verily, verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, Thine heart have I prepared to do this work. Editor, William E. McLellin. Okay. So clearly, McLellin thinks Joseph's a fallen prophet and guilty of the worst kind of sins: malignant pride, gross ambition, warmongering, having the spirit of Antichrist. But in March of 1847, before his diatribe against Joseph, McLellin also wrote in the same Ensign of Liberty about a visit he had only a few months earlier with Emma Smith. Quote, On Saturday, the 28th of August, we visited the fated city of Nauvoo and put up at the Nauvoo house, which is excellently kept by Mrs. Emma Smith, the enterprising widow of Joseph Smith, deceased. I spent about 24 hours in the deserted and yet partly populated city. I had many hours' conversation with Mrs. Smith and learned many particulars from her relative to the history of her husband from her first acquaintance with him until the time of his cruel death. Among many others, I asked her this question: Have you any confidence in the Book of Mormon and the work of the last days? Her answer was prompt. I have all confidence in that spirit of intelligence by which the Book of Mormon was translated and by which the revelations were given to the church in the beginning. Although a widow, I admired the order of her family circle. Now, we cannot verify if that meeting actually happened, but he did report it shortly after he claims he met with Emma. But did you catch that? He met with Emma for many hours. They talked about her husband Joseph's history. She bore firm testimony of the Book of Mormon. Now, what did he not say? He did not state that Emma communicated anything about Joseph being involved in anything untoward with any women. He doesn't mention a word about a Miss Hill, Fanny Alger, a barn, or adultery, or polygamy, or sealing at all. But what's more, later in 1848, he would also write about various groups competing to be the successors of the Restoration. He spoke against those following Sidney Rigdon, James Strang, and those following the Latter-day Saints and the Quorum of the 12, people he calls Twelvites. About them, he wrote, quote, "After the priesthood is conferred upon a man, he may pollute the holy authority of it by using its influence and authority to commit sin with. He must use his ministerial power to assist him to violate the laws of God. For instance, to do as the Twelvites have done. Go to females and persuade them that what the Gentiles call adultery is no crime, but that a plurality of wives is the stepping stone to the highest degree of glory, and do that in the name of the Lord, by the authority of their priestly power. Thus the abomination is committed, the holy authority of the priesthood polluted, and I know of no rule of salvation after the second offense for such beings." He also writes, quote, "Twelvism is partly made up of pluralities. They hold the doctrine of a 12-headed head of their church. They believe in many wives and concubines. Though woman, say they, is the glory of the man, consequently, the more women, the more glory. Now to be a Twelvite, these are only a few of the blasphemous absurdities to be believed and swallowed, and we dislike to even pen the truth about them." So, while McLellin outs the 12 apostles for believing in having many wives and concubines, what does he not say? He expressly does not say that the 12 got this doctrine from Joseph. He does not claim that Joseph was practicing polygamy. This is a highly curious omission, given the fact that a number of very public accusations had been made against Joseph in this regard during Joseph's life, something McLellin would absolutely have known. And yet, McLellin doesn't implicate Joseph in the Twelvite polygamy here at all. So this requires us to ask, if this man, William McLellin, who apparently hated the prophet Joseph Smith, who robbed Emma's house when Joseph was in prison, when he was trying to prove to the world that Joseph was a fallen prophet, guilty of the worst sins and being filled with the spirit of Antichrist, if William had learned anything from Emma, that Joseph was indeed guilty of adultery with Fanny Alger, if she had actually told him that she witnessed the, quote, transaction in the barn, if McLellin had any information whatsoever that Joseph had been in any way engaged in the practice of having many wives and concubines, if any of that were true, is it at all conceivable that he would have left that out of the ensign of liberty? If he had the slightest proof to be able to say, quote, "And I declare that Joseph's own wife Emma told me herself that Joseph committed adultery with a Miss Hill and his hired girl Fanny Alger," is there any way he wouldn't have shouted that from the rooftops? The fact that he never said anything of the kind proves that what he would later write to Emma's son Joseph III in 1872 about that very conversation in 1847 that he claimed he had with Emma is nothing more nor less than a bold-faced lie. And yet, virtually every historian who has written on the subject cites the 1872 letter from McLellin to Joseph III and lends that letter varying degrees of credibility. The historians have access to all of this material, but for whatever reason, they have not made this connection. Now, I showed you the Don Bradley and Chris Smith example because I believe they've done the most thorough work of all the historians with the Fanny Alger material. But because of their absolute reliance on the McLellin source, in my view, the analysis falls apart because their assertion that Joseph most likely adopted Fanny first and then had some sort of erotic encounter with her, it relies mostly on McLellin for substantiation. Now, I'm not picking on Bradley and Smith. I think that they do excellent work. I think everyone should read their work on Fanny. But this is what I mean by historical malpractice. Again, it's not pejorative. It's an accurate description of negligent or improper professional conduct. In this case, it's categorically improper to assess the Oliver Cowdery incident and the Fanny Alger references through the lens of William McLellin without fully acknowledging McLellin's bitter antagonism toward Joseph and the inconsistent points in his statements. It is patently negligent to ignore the 1847 Ensign of Liberty material when assessing the reliability of the letter in 1872 and the article in 1875. I am calling on the historians to not use the McLellin source any longer as a credible source. If the historians persist in using it, I believe they can only honestly reference it as part of the historical narrative, but they must give the full context of McLellin as a witness, which is that he is simply not credible. His bias and rank hatred for Joseph Smith, as well as his own words, betray him as such. Will the historians acknowledge this? Let's hope. Now, the critics of this argument will still claim that there's enough later evidence to say that Fanny was Joseph's wife. When you first understand and acknowledge that the McLellin source is a verifiable lie and that you cannot use it with credibility, the other sources, with all of their inconsistencies and contradictions, lose their strength and clarity. As the first domino of the McLellin source falls, the other sources likewise tip over like dominoes in their credibility as well. And when you look at the diminutive collection of what Brian Hales calls the late and second-hand reminiscences, and I would add very late and problematic, unreliable second-hand recollections, those simply don't add up to anything conclusive, but rather raise far more questions than provide answers. We will discuss all that's related to Fanny and Joseph in a later episode. Back to our timeline where Joseph continues to instruct and admonish regarding marriage. In July of 1838, Joseph, as editor of the Elders' Journal, published his answers to a list of questions related to Mormon belief and practice. He again felt it necessary to clarify the church's position related to polygamy. Question 6. Do the Mormons believe in having all things in common? Answer, no. Question 7. Do the Mormons believe in having more wives than one? Answer, no, not at the same time. But they believe that if their companion dies, they have a right to marry again. But we do disapprove of the custom which has gained in the world and has been practiced among us, to our great mortification, of marrying in 5 or 6 weeks, or even in 2 or 3 months after the death of their companion. We believe that due respect ought to be had to the memory of the dead and the feelings of both friends and children. Then, on the 8th of July, 1838, Joseph Smith received a pointed revelation, now in LDS D&C 11711, warning Newell Whitney to stay away from polygamy. Quote, "Let my servant N.K. Whitney be ashamed of the Nicolaitans and of all their secret abominations, and of all his littleness of soul before me, saith the Lord, and come up unto the land of Adamondiaman, and be a bishop unto my people, saith the Lord. Not in name, but in deed, says the Lord." The Nicolaitans referred to here were an early 1st century group which John the Beloved mentioned in Revelations 2 verse 6. In this passage, the Lord gives John these strong words, "But this thou hast, that thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate." According to early church fathers, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement, Hippolytus, Epiphanius, and Theodoret, and Thomas Aquinas, the Nicolaitans practiced a form of open marriage, wife-swapping, and polygamy. The Lord said he hated the deeds of these polygamists. Despite the Lord's warning to Newell to stay away from polygamy, and despite his long marriage to Elizabeth and Whitney, who bore him 12 children, after Joseph's death, Newell would disobey the Lord's command to him and take 7 wives by January 1846. As we will see, William Phelps and Newell Whitney were not the only men close to Joseph who would receive personal instructions against polygamy and later go on to do exactly the opposite of what Joseph taught them and what the Lord commanded them through Joseph. In August of 1838, as editor of the Elders' Journal, Joseph Smith published an article entitled "On the Duty of Husband and Wife," which stated, quote, "It is the duty of a husband to love, cherish, and nourish his wife, and cleave unto her, and none else. He ought to honor her as himself, and he ought to regard her feelings with tenderness. For she is his flesh and his bone, designed to be an help unto him, both in temporal and spiritual things, one into whose bosom he can pour all his complaints without reserve, who is willing, being designed, to take part of his burden, to soothe and encourage his feelings by her gentle voice. It is the place of the man to stand at the head of the family and be lord over his own house, not to rule over his wife as a tyrant, neither as one who is fearful or jealous that his wife will get out of her place and prevent him from exercising his authority. Now, let's consider Joseph's words for a moment. It's our duty to cleave unto our spouse and none else. Again, he's proclaiming monogamous marriage. His strict admonition to all husbands that we must love, cherish, nourish, regard their feelings with tenderness, never rule fearfully, jealously, exercise authority as a tyrant, that stands in stark contrast to the treatment that we know so many polygamous wives received, and as we learned last episode with Augusta Cobb. Joseph's words on the duty of husband and wife serve as just one more example of the absolute distinction between what Joseph Smith taught during his life and what later polygamists like Brigham Young would teach. Nauvoo, Sunday, March 9, 1845. President Brigham Young spoke. Relief Society going to meet again. I say I will curse every man that lets his wife or daughters meet again until I tell them. What are relief societies for? To relieve us of our best men. They relieved us of Joseph and Hiram. That is what they will lead to. I don't want the advice or counsel of any woman. They would lead us down to hell. There is no woman on the face of the earth that can save herself, but if she ever comes into the celestial kingdom, she must be led in by some man. God knew what Eve was. He was acquainted with woman thousands and millions of years before. You say that man ought to die for transgressing the law of God? Let me suppose a case. Suppose you found your brother in bed with your wife and put a javelin through both of them. You would be justified, and they would atone for their sins and be received into the kingdom of God. I would at once do so in such a case, and under such circumstances, I have no wife whom I love so well that I would not put a javelin through her heart, and I would do it with clean hands. Woman must atone for sins committed by the volition of her own choice, but she will never become an angel to the devil and sin so far as to place herself beyond the reach of mercy. She will suffer all that she has strength to suffer according to the venality of her sins. The woman is the glory of the man. What is the glory of the woman? It is her virginity, until she gives it into the hands of the man that will be her Lord and Master to all eternity. Our sisters are very tenacious with regard to a man's having more than one wife. Says the wife, quote, husband, I am capable of making your dinner. I can make your bed. I can tend to your fiscal wants. You do not need another woman in this house. Do you not know that is a curse placed upon the woman? Why so? That she may not become an angel to the devil. It is the order of heaven she should suffer in the flesh. Will you say you will not suffer in the flesh? That you will not be cursed? That you will have the fullest satisfaction of this life and let the next life take care of itself? And now, Mr. Husband, if you do not make a heaven for me, I will leave you. You have a curse upon you that the male portion of the human family have not got. Now notice the curse that is placed upon the woman. Quote, unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Yes, your desire shall be for him, and it is one of the hardest things you can think of to consent that your husband should take another wife. And when you bring forth, it shall be in extreme pain. Were it not for this curse, woman would not have suffered pain in childbearing. She has taken the lead in committing sin, and she will fill her days with sorrow. She shall desire this and that and the other, and her disposition and affection and her whole being shall be afflicted as much as the man, but his afflictions are of another kind. Let me say one thing to the young girls, and what I shall tell you, I wish you to ponder in your hearts and say nothing about it. For the wicked world has no business with these things, nor half-hearted Mormons. And if there is any here who will not make a good use of what they hear, the evil shall be upon themselves. I wish to say to my young sisters, If you can go into the hands of a man that will lead you into the kingdom of heaven and exalt you there to become an Eve, a queen of heaven, the wife of a god, and you can remain with that man whom your soul delights, and you take to him your virginity, you have obtained a treasure that millions of worlds like this could not buy from you, for there is your glory to all eternity. Trifle with this matter, and you will reap sorrow and affliction. Elders, never love your wives one hair's breadth further than they adorn the gospel. Never love them so, but that you can leave them at a moment's warning without shedding a tear. Should you love a child any more than this? No. Here are apostles and prophets who are destined to be exalted with the gods, to become rulers in the kingdoms of our Father, to become equal with the Father and the Son. And will you let your affections be unduly placed on anything this side of that kingdom and glory? If you do, you disgrace your calling and priesthood. The very moment that persons in this church suffer their affections to be immoderately placed upon an object this side of the celestial kingdom, they disgrace their profession and calling. When you love your wives and children, are fond of your horses, your carriages, your fine houses, your goods and chattels, or anything of an earthly nature, before your affections become too strong, wait until your family are sealed up into eternal lives, and you know they are yours from that time henceforth and forever. When the wife secures to herself a glorious resurrection, she is worthy of the full measure of the love of the faithful husband, but never before. And when a man has passed through the veil and secured to himself an eternal exaltation, he is then worthy of the love of his wife and children, and not until then, unless he has received the promise and is sealed up unto eternal lives. Then he may be an object full worthy of their affections and love on the earth, and not before. You find no such teachings or language ever from Joseph. Our final event of the timeline of 1838. If you come from any of the branches of Mormonism, you undoubtedly have heard of Joseph's famous letter from Liberty Jail. But did you know that he specifically addressed polygamy in that letter and called it once again an abomination? On December 16, 1838, from his cold, dank confines, Joseph wrote, quote, "Know assuredly, dear brethren, that it is for the testimony of Jesus that we are in the bonds and in prison. Was it for committing adultery? We are aware that false and slanderous reports have gone abroad, which have reached our ears respecting this thing, which have been started by renegades and spread by the dissenters, who are extremely active in spreading foul and libelous reports concerning us, thinking thereby to gain the fellowship of the world. Some have reported that we not only dedicated our property, but likewise our families to the Lord, and Satan, taking advantage of this, has transfigured it into lasciviousness, a community of wives, which things are an abomination in the sight of God. And when a man consecrates or dedicates his wife and children to the Lord, he does not give them to his brother or to his neighbor, which is contrary to the law of God, which says, 'Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. He that looketh upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery already in his heart. Now for a man to consecrate his property, his wife, and children to the Lord is nothing more nor less than to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the widows and fatherless, the sick and afflicted, and do all he can to administer to their relief in their afflictions, and for himself and his house to serve the Lord. In order to do this, he and all his house must be virtuous and shun every appearance of evil. Now, if any person has represented anything otherwise than what we now write, they have willfully misrepresented us." As Joseph closed out the Kirtland and Missouri era, among his final words were a strong declaration that a community of wives, or polygamy, is adultery and an abomination. Well, that concludes this episode of Still Mormon. I hope this information was helpful to you. It certainly was for me the first time I learned it. I'd like to speak personally to you because this is very personal to me. I learned something just a few weeks ago. I heard a story of a young woman I know quite well. she was talking in a group of other young adults, and they were talking about religion and faith, and out of the blue almost, one of the young adults said, "You know, Joseph Smith's a rapist, don't you?" And this young woman, shocked, before she could catch her breath, another person in the group said, "Well, yeah, it's in the church's essays." And this was devastating to this young woman. And that is so unfortunate and unnecessary, as we've shown today. I want to make an appeal to anyone who's passed on that story before. I want to make an appeal to online content creators, podcasters, YouTubers, people making TikToks and shorts. If you've passed on that story before, I hope you'll take it down. Or I hope you'll make a correction. I hope that you'll have the courage to come out and say, "I was wrong." I implore you to rethink how you have cavalierly passed on something that's entirely not true. And I'll extend some grace to you. You didn't know. But I hope from this point forward, you will not pass on that erroneous information. And to the historians, I want to also make an appeal to stop using William McLellin as a credible source. His 1875 and 1872 statements on Fanny Alger, on Emma, on what happened in the barn. And if you still use that source, please at least give it credibility, or rather give it context with the 1847 Ensign of Liberty. And if you don't, I believe you forfeit your credibility. So I hope that the historians will re-examine the case on Fanny Alger, and that they will stop speaking with certainty that something happened, something that was erotic or intimate or sexual. And they will simply say, "We don't really know," because that's the truth. Now, in the beginning, I said that I would play you a little bit more from the Dean of Mormon History, Dr. Richard Bushman. Let's play the tape.
Do you believe that Joseph Smith had sex with these women?
I'll tell you what the evidence is.
That's what I'm, because I don't.
The evidence is simply this. When the missionaries from the reorganized church, Joseph III and his brothers, came out here, they were claiming, well, there might have been some kind of relationship, but it was not sexual. So Brigham Young goes to all the former wives of Joseph Smith and brings them in and has them sign affidavits. But
why would he do that?
To prove that they had the true polygamy.
Yes.
And the reorganized were wrong in saying it was just spiritual sin.
Yes. Well, but where it goes off the tracks is when you have these younger girls and all of,
but see, you don't want to worry about too much about that. Well, my view of it is that Joseph practiced a different kind of polygamy than Brigham Young. Brigham Young practiced domestic polygamy.
Yes.
You have a wife, you find a house for her, you have sexual intercourse, you rear children. That's domestic polygamy. Joseph's was simply sealing polygamy. He didn't set up households, he didn't care for people. Well, there's a problem with all this stuff. A lot of the things that are attributed to Joseph Smith, my guess is this would be one, were recorded 30 years after the fact.
Yes.
And as a historian, I have trouble with things that are that far along. Thoughts have been shaped by what's happening. You're trying to justify what has occurred.
Okay, so Dr. Bushman thinks there's something different about what Brigham Young was doing and what Joseph Smith was doing. Did you catch that? He called Brigham Young's polygamy domestic polygamy. Marry a woman, bring her into your house, have sexual intercourse, have children, etc., support her. Joseph's, he calls that a sealing polygamy. It's a ceremonial polygamy. Richard Bushman, the Dean of Mormon History, doesn't believe that Joseph was practicing what Brigham was. Did you know that? Historians, did you know that? Are there any other historians that concur? Now, the only issue I would take with that statement is using the word polygamy in conjunction with what Joseph was doing, because if there's no sex in the equation, which appears that's what Bushman believes, and it's what I believe, if there's no sex in the equation, what are we talking about? We are certainly not talking about polygamy. So, I just wanted to play that for you because I think it's really important to understand that there's at least one historian that doesn't see it the way that the others do, and that perhaps we all might want to rethink the entire narrative. Well, next time, I hope you'll come back, because what I'm going to show you in the next episode about what one historian in his notes called a promiscuous form of spiritual wifery was going on before Nauvoo in England. You are not going to want to miss the most explosive evidence I have presented thus far. That's next time. Thanks for stopping by.